To understand the profound shock that a simple chocolate bar could deliver, you first have to understand the mind of the man who received it. Picture him, a German soldier in late 1944. Let's call him Klaus. For years, Klaus's entire reality has been forged in the crucible of Nazi ideology and the brutal pragmatism of the Eastern Front. His worldview is a fortress, built from bricks of ceaseless propaganda. He has been told, and has come to believe, that he is a part of a master race, a biological and spiritual elite destined to rule. The enemies he fights are subhuman, inferior, or, in the case of the Americans, a hopelessly naive and decadent collection of gangsters, cowboys, and mongrels, led by Jewish capitalists. He has seen the newsreels, triumphant and bombastic, showing the might of the Wehrmacht and the industrial genius of the Reich. He has been assured that the American system, a chaotic mess of democracy and consumerism, lacks the will, the discipline, and the internal cohesion to wage a true, total war. Every scrap of information he has ever received has been meticulously curated to reinforce this single, unshakable idea. The German way is the way of strength and realism. The American way is one of weakness and illusion. His world is hard, cold, and unforgiving. He knows the gnawing reality of scarcity, the constant, dull ache of hunger, and the iron law that nothing, absolutely nothing, is ever given for free. This soldier, Klaus, is not an abstract concept. He is the product of a system meticulously designed to create him. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent more than a decade perfecting its message. It painted America not as a sleeping giant, but as a flabby, complacent degenerate, too busy listening to jazz music and indulging in material comforts to ever match the Spartan warrior ethos of the Third Reich. German soldiers were told that American factories, while numerous, were inefficient, staffed by striking workers, and incapable of the centralized, state-driven output that defined the German war economy. They heard tales of American soldiers being soft, poorly trained city boys who would break at the first sign of real hardship. The central question underpinning their entire fight was this: how could a society built on individual comfort possibly defeat a society built on collective sacrifice? For Klaus, shivering in a foxhole in the Ardennes, this wasn't just propaganda. It was the logical foundation of his world. He had endured hardships his American counterparts could not possibly imagine. He had eaten stale bread that was more sawdust than flour, and drank bitter ersatz coffee. The idea of American superiority was not just wrong, it was laughable, a fairy tale told by a dying system. He was a veteran, a survivor, a testament to German resilience. His certainty was absolute. Then the world ends. Not in a single glorious explosion, but in the terrifying, overwhelming crush of steel and fire that was the Allied counterattack. The certainty that had been Klaus's armor for years is ripped away. One moment he is a soldier of the Reich, defending the fatherland. The next, he is on his knees in the snow, hands laced behind his head, the guttural shouts of American GIs replacing the familiar sounds of his own platoon. The moment of capture is the moment of ultimate dread. He expects a bullet, a bayonet, or at the very least, a brutal kick from a mud-caked boot. This is what war is. This is the fate of the vanquished, the grim transaction he has always understood. He and his comrades are herded into a line, a shuffling procession of the defeated, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and exhausted resignation. He avoids eye contact, keeping his gaze fixed on the churned-up mud, waiting for the inevitable violence that must follow surrender. He braces himself for the blow, but the blow never comes. Instead, there is a different sound. The rustling of wax paper, a quiet word exchanged between the guards. A hand appears in front of his face, not clenched in a fist, but open. In the palm sits a small, dark brown rectangle. It's a Hershey's chocolate bar. For a long moment, Klaus doesn't comprehend what he is seeing. His mind, conditioned by years of war and deprivation, simply cannot process the information. This object is an impossibility. Chocolate, true chocolate, was a ghost, a memory from a peacetime that felt a century away. It was a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of the Nazi Party, a mythical treat whispered about by civilians. On the German home front, a bar like this could be traded for a week's worth of vital supplies. It was a symbol of wealth, of a life of impossible ease. Yet, here it was, in the middle of a war zone, being handed out by a common soldier to his most hated enemy. He thinks it must be a trick. Perhaps it's poisoned, a cruel final joke. He looks at the American GI, a young man who looks impossibly well fed, his cheeks full, and his uniform clean and new. The American just nods, gesturing for him to take it. There's no malice in his eyes, no triumphant sneer. There's only a strange, almost bored indifference, as if he were handing out a leaflet. This casualness is more disorienting than brutality would have been. It's the sheer, unbelievable, maddening normalcy of the act. Hesitantly, Klaus takes the bar. The weight of it alone is a surprise. It feels dense, substantial. He unwraps a corner and the scent hits him, rich and sweet. A smell so alien and long forgotten, it almost makes him dizzy. He breaks off a piece and places it in his mouth. The sensation is a physical shock. It's not the gritty, waxy ersatz substitute he might have known. It's smooth, creamy, and intensely sweet. It is real. And in that moment, as the chocolate melts on his tongue, the first foundational brick of his ideological fortress crumbles into dust. The act is incomprehensible. Why would a nation waste such a valuable commodity on its prisoners? An army that could afford to give away chocolate bars to its defeated enemies was not a weak, decadent, or desperate army. It was an army backed by a power so vast, so staggeringly immense, that it defied every piece of propaganda he had ever been fed. This wasn't a gesture of kindness that he could have dismissed as a fluke. This was a gesture of plenty. It was the first terrifying piece of evidence that the entire war, his entire sacrifice, might have been based on a catastrophic, world-ending lie. The real war wasn't just about tanks and bullets, it was about systems, and his system had just been defeated by a chocolate bar. The single Hershey's bar was only the first shot in a relentless psychological barrage. As Klaus and his fellow prisoners were moved from the front lines, the true, terrifying nature of American power began to reveal itself not through weapons, but through logistics. The assault came in the form of the standard-issue K-ration. It was a simple, wax-coated cardboard box, but inside was a universe of disbelief. There wasn't just the chocolate bar, which he soon learned was the standardized, heat-resistant Ration D bar, produced by the millions specifically for this purpose. There was more: canned meat, cheese, or eggs, a packet of biscuits, 4 cigarettes, a stick of chewing gum, and pouches of instant coffee, sugar, and powdered bouillon. The sheer caloric value was staggering, easily exceeding 3,000 calories per day, more than many German civilians were seeing in a week. For soldiers accustomed to the Wehrmacht's late-war diet of thin soup, coarse black bread, and the occasional piece of horse meat, this was a feast. The Americans weren't just feeding them, they were feeding them well. Every prisoner received the same box, a testament to a level of standardization and mass production that the German war economy, now cannibalizing itself to survive, could only dream of. The message was implicit and brutal. This is what we give away. Imagine what we keep for ourselves. The journey westward, away from the collapsing front, was a rolling, endless panorama of industrial might. Klaus saw it from the back of an American GMC truck, one of over 800,000 2.5-ton trucks the U.S. would produce during the war. He saw convoys so long their beginnings and ends were lost over the horizon, a mechanical serpent of supply slithering across France. This was the famous Red Ball Express, a logistics operation of such scale it was practically a mobile industry. This sight alone was a profound humiliation. By 1944, the Wehrmacht, for all its panzer divisions, was still overwhelmingly dependent on horsepower. Over 80% of its transport relied on animals. Germany had started the war with more horses than it had in 1914. Now, Klaus watched as the Americans used bulldozers to clear roads, lay down prefabricated steel runways for their aircraft in a matter of days, and erected vast cities of tents complete with electric generators and field hospitals. It was a war fought and won by the quartermaster. The sheer volume of things, crates of ammunition, fuel drums, spare tires, medical supplies, piled in casual mountains at every depot, was an argument more powerful than any artillery barrage. It spoke of a nation that wasn't just fighting a war, but was exporting its entire industrial base directly onto the battlefield. In a temporary holding pen near Reims, surrounded by the barbed wire and the casual efficiency of his captors, Klaus listened to an older officer, a cynical major who had fought from Poland to Stalingrad. The major gathered a group of younger NCOs, his face a mask of bitter resignation. "You are all wondering about the chocolate and the cigarettes," he began, his voice low. "You think it is kindness. It is not. It is a weapon. It is the purest weapon they have." He picked up a stone and scratched in the dirt. "Back home, the party tells us about the heroic German worker, building our tanks. For every panzer we build, they build 5 Shermans. We perfect a new machine gun. They produce 10,000 of a simpler, good-enough model. We have been told this is a war of will, of spirit. That is a lie we told ourselves. This is a war of mathematics. It is a war of factories." The major looked each man in the eye. "We are not fighting soldiers. We never were. We are fighting the Ford Motor Company. We are fighting General Electric. We are fighting the American housewife who donates her bacon grease to the munitions board. Their system, their chaotic, decadent, wasteful system, is outproducing our glorious, centralized, efficient Reich by a factor that would make Dr. Goebbels weep. That Hershey bar is not a gift. It is a final report from their board of directors." This cold, industrial logic was reflected in the Americans themselves. Klaus had been trained to see the GI as an unworthy adversary, a soft boy pulled from a life of luxury. The reality was far more unsettling. The American soldiers he encountered were not the fanatical supermen of his own propaganda. They were alarmingly normal. They complained about the food, the rain, and their officers with a casual disrespect that would have earned a German soldier a court-martial. They chewed gum while on guard duty. They seemed to view the war not as a glorious crusade for a 1,000-year Reich, but as a dirty, unpleasant job they wanted to finish so they could go home to their cars and their girlfriends. Their competence was detached, professional, and devoid of the ideological fury he had been taught was necessary for victory. This was the system in human form. It was a system so powerful, so wealthy, and so confident that it did not require its soldiers to be fanatics. It only required them to be competent cogs in a vast, unstoppable machine of production and logistics. The German soldier was told he was the sharp tip of the spear. The American soldier acted like he was just the guy who drove the truck that delivered 10,000 more spears. The turning point, the moment the conflict in his mind became an undeniable collapse of his entire reality, occurred upon arrival at a permanent POW camp in the United States. After a long voyage on a ship where, to his astonishment, no one starved, he was put on a train. Through the window he saw a country untouched by war. No bombed-out cities, no shell craters, just endless fields and bustling towns. The camp itself was the final crushing absurdity. It wasn't the death pit he had been promised. It was a small, meticulously organized town. There were clean wooden barracks, hot showers, a mess hall that served 3 meals a day with meat, bread, potatoes, and even coffee. There was a library, a sports field, and a canteen where prisoners, using the small wages they earned from working on local farms, could buy extra cigarettes, magazines, and, to his everlasting shock, more Hershey's chocolate bars. His initial worldview, that of a superior warrior from a superior system, was now proven so catastrophically, so undeniably wrong. The American system provided a better quality of life for its prisoners of war than the Third Reich could provide for its own fighting men. How do you reconcile that? What would you think if the comforts your enemy gave you in prison surpassed the life you were fighting to defend back home? The full psychological impact of this new reality was a slow-acting poison. In the POW camps scattered across America, from Alabama to Wisconsin, German soldiers began to suffer from what they called Sociological, barbed-wire disease. But this was a condition born not just of confinement, but of cognitive dissonance. The prisoners were physically healthier than they had been in years, but mentally they were adrift in a sea of vertigo. Their entire universe of belief had been inverted. The masters were now captives, and the decadent inferiors were their impossibly wealthy and efficient jailers. The daily routine of camp life was a relentless series of absurdities that chipped away at their sanity. They would be taken by truck to work on local farms, replacing the American boys who were overseas fighting them. They were paid for their labor, 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which they could then use to buy American consumer goods. They saw the civilians, farmers driving their own cars, their wives heading to town to shop in stores overflowing with goods. This peaceful, productive, impossibly normal American heartland was more terrifying than any battlefield. It was a living, breathing refutation of every ideal they had been conditioned to believe, a constant, silent testament to their own system's failure. Perhaps no single object captured this systemic humiliation more powerfully than the Sears mail order catalog. In some camps, these thick, heavy volumes, the so-called wish books, were made available to the prisoners. For Klaus, flipping through its pages was a journey to another planet. It was a document of a civilization so wealthy it had lost all connection to the grim realities of scarcity he knew. There were hundreds of pages devoted to things that had no military or even practical purpose, 20 different styles of wristwatches, 30 different patterns of floral dresses for women, entire sections on fishing lures, electric kitchen mixers, children's toys, and power tools for the home hobbyist. This wasn't a catalog, it was a weaponized display of superfluous production. The Third Reich, even at its peak, had focused its entire industrial might on the tools of war. Civilian production was gutted for the cause. Yet, here was a nation that could simultaneously build tens of thousands of bombers and tanks, supply a global war on two fronts, and still have enough leftover industrial capacity to produce 15 different models of garden hose nozzles. It was the crushing, undeniable proof that the American system treated war as just one more item on its vast production schedule, while for Germany, war was a total, all-consuming, and ultimately fatal national effort. One night, under the dim light of the barracks, Klaus found himself unable to write a cheerful, censored letter home. The lie was too great. Instead, he opened a small private journal and let the dam of his disillusionment break. This is a reconstruction of what a mind like his must have felt. Tonight, we had beef stew and peaches. I saw a picture in a magazine of a new car, a beautiful, shining car for an ordinary family, and I thought of Otto. I thought of him freezing to death outside of Stalingrad, his lips blue, chewing on a piece of frozen bread that was mostly sawdust. We were told his sacrifice was for the glory of a greater Germany, a superior system. What glory is there in starving for a lie? We were told we were wolves, and the Americans were sheep. But the sheep live in warm houses, and their wolves are so well fed they can afford to spare their scraps for the defeated. Everything the Führer told us, everything our officers screamed at us, it was all a fantasy. They told us America was a house of cards. We see now it is a fortress of steel, built on a mountain of wheat and corn and chocolate. Otto died for a ghost. He died for a miscalculation. And I am alive, a prisoner of the men who run the world's most efficient slaughterhouse, and they give me peaches for dessert. This intensely personal realization rippled outwards, becoming a collective, unspoken truth among the prisoners. They began to understand the fundamental philosophical chasm between the two systems. Their Germany was a pyramid. The Führer sat at the top, and every bloc, every person, existed solely to support the weight of the state. The individual was nothing. The collective was everything. Sacrifice, duty, and a glorious death in service to the nation were the highest virtues. But America seemed to be an inverted pyramid. The system, for all its chaos and apparent wastefulness, seemed to exist for the benefit of the individual at the bottom. The promise wasn't a glorious death, but a good life. A house, a car, a refrigerator full of food, the right to complain, to get rich, to be comfortable. This was the decadence they had been trained to mock, but here, inside the wire, they saw it as the engine of a terrifyingly resilient power. A society that promises its people comfort is a society where people will work tirelessly to produce that comfort. What motivation is ultimately stronger? The promise of a better life for yourself, or the promise of a glorious death for the state? The final climax was not a bang, but a whimper. It was the quiet, hollowed-out acceptance in the eyes of men who knew they had been utterly and completely beaten, not just on the battlefield, but in the very contest of ideas. The arrogance of the Übermensch, the swagger of the master race, evaporated in the daily routine of camp life. Klaus watched men who once conquered nations now spend their days carving little wooden figures, learning English from farm children, or passionately arguing the rules of baseball, a game whose complex statistics and leisurely pace seemed to embody the American spirit. The grand historic mission of the Third Reich had shrunk to the size of a prison barracks in a country they had fatally underestimated. The psychological shock was complete. Their worldview had been systematically identified, targeted, and destroyed. And the weapon that had achieved this total victory was not a bomb or a bullet. It was the staggering, undeniable, and casually distributed evidence of a system that could produce an endless supply of Hershey's chocolate bars. The war was over for them, and the deepest wound was the realization that it had been lost long before they ever fired a shot. The war ended, and eventually the prisoners were sent home. For Klaus and the nearly 400,000 other German POWs held in the United States, this final journey was perhaps the most jarring of all. They had spent months or even years in a strange bubble of clean barracks and abundant food, watching the American heartland thrive. They returned to a ghost country. Germany was a nation not just defeated but annihilated. Their cities were apocalyptic landscapes of rubble. Their economy had ceased to exist, and their people were starving, haunted specters picking through the ruins. The homecoming was the final brutal confirmation of everything they had come to understand in the camps. They had left a nation convinced of its own imminent, glorious victory and returned to the physical proof of its absolute failure. They were now outsiders in their own land, possessing a terrible knowledge that their countrymen, who had endured the Gotterdammerung of the final collapse, could not fully comprehend. They had not only seen the enemy, they had lived inside its engine room, and they knew better than anyone that the war had been lost on the assembly lines of Detroit and in the wheat fields of Kansas long before it was lost in the ruins of Berlin. The story of the German POWs and the Hershey's bar is far more than a curious historical footnote. It is an enduring parable about the true nature of modern power. It reveals a universal truth that transcends the Second World War, that great conflicts between nation-states are ultimately wars of systems. They are contests of production, logistics, and economic endurance. The lesson learned in the fields of Camp Forest, Tennessee, and in the mess halls of Camp Grant, Illinois, was that a totalitarian ideology, for all its terrifying power to mobilize a nation through fear and fanaticism, is a brittle and inefficient thing. It is a system that consumes its own people in its quest for glory. The American system of democratic consumer capitalism, for all its apparent chaos, waste, and focus on individual comfort proved to be a far more resilient, adaptable, and devastatingly productive war machine. The soft power of a society that can afford to be generous and wasteful is, in the end, a harder and more effective weapon than the goose-stepping discipline of a society that has forgotten how to be anything but brutal. Ideology makes a poor shield against the crushing mathematical reality of a superior supply chain. The lasting legacy of this quiet, psychological conflict is the confirmation that the most effective weapon in the American arsenal was America itself. The victor was not just the GI, but the entire civilian-industrial complex that stood behind him. A system capable of producing both the Sherman tank and the chocolate bar with equal, overwhelming efficiency. The profound shock experienced by German soldiers was the shock of discovering that their entire worldview, forged in hardship and sacrifice, was a fatal delusion. They believed they were hardened realists fighting decadent dreamers, only to discover they were the ones living in a fantasy, a dark fairy tale of their own superiority that collapsed the moment it touched the real world. The war of ideas was not won in the lecture halls of re-education camps, but in the simple, daily transactions of a society of plenty. It was won when a prisoner of war tasted a piece of real chocolate for the first time in years, and realized, in that single, sweet, humiliating moment, that he was fighting for the wrong side. The 1,000-year Reich, in the end, was not brought down by a new Roman legion, but by the American factory worker, the American farmer, and the simple, undeniable, mass-produced argument of a Hershey's chocolate bar.